has been around.
81 years.
That's longer than me.
Yeah.
I can't say that about everything. It started out as family housing for the soldiers from Fort Meade. 8 decades later, we will learn how the neighborhood has evolved from a blended family that has lived or been connected to Meade Avenue since 1954. That's a long time. Virginia Fitzpatrick, a Sturgis High graduate, mother of 3, and familiar voice to anyone who's called 911. Ryan, her youngest son, is he here? Okay. Will bring us some of the perspectives of a modern court neighborhood. And Dave Super, we love ya. He's an occasional contributor to History at High Noon and a Scuba History programs. They are a trio of Comanche court kids who have witnessed just about everything in a place they'll always call home. And you know, I wish all of us could do that. So, welcome.
Okay. Well, I got to talk fast so that those of you who are in the audience who are from Comanche Court can relate some of your own tall tales or short tales or whatever in order to tell everybody about the neighborhood, what it's like, what it's like to claim that place as home, whether it's for a really long time, like my sister and her family, or a few months, or I think in recent years for the rally people that come for a few days, or whatever, that so they've touched Comanche Court one way or another. So, to begin, Fort Meade, we all know about it, of course. Prior to World War II, Fort Meade was hanging on by its fingernails, just like a lot of military communities and other government functions and the like, depending on the whims of Congress and world events and a whole lot of other things. And there was discussion as it looked like war was going to start in Europe and eventually in the Pacific, that the 4th Cavalry, which was the unit at Fort Meade, was going to deploy and never come back. And what would that mean for the town? It would be devastating. The 4th had been at Fort Meade as a military unit longer than in any of the others, and folks wanted to keep the unit in town. It was a source of jobs and pride and activity and just a whole bunch of things. And so in 1940, Mayor Atwater and a guy who I was unfamiliar with, Ray Bronson, he was a pharmacist from Belle Fourche who became a tourist promoter. Think of him as kind of the Hoadley Dean or the Paul Besseliever or Bill Honerkamp of his era, promoting tourism. He gave up the drugstore and went into the tourist promotion business. Atwater and...
We're having trouble hearing you, Dave. You got...
Back here, okay, is that?
Thank you.
Now you can hear better in the back?
Yes.
Okay. Atwater and Bronson went to Washington, D.C. They were going to go right to the top and figure out what needs to be done. Are the rumors true? Is Fort Meade going to really pull out of, or is the 4th really going to pull out of Fort Meade? And we're going to be stuck with an empty place and all of that. So they go to Washington, D.C. They talk to the congressman at the time, Chan Gurney, and Bushfield, the 2 senators, and then Representative Francis Case. They talked to senior officials in the military and the War Department. Come on, level with us. What's going to happen to Fort Meade? Well, they were assured that not only would the 4th stay at Fort Meade, but here's a promise to build 50 homes for senior NCOs and barracks for another 900 soldiers. So these guys come back home, kind of heroes. They didn't save the fort, but they were bringing good news back to Sturgis. that Fort Meade would stay in business and that the 4th Cavalry would remain there. And so that didn't diminish the need for more housing. That promise of 50 houses eventually settled on a more realistic 35 residences that were going to be built in town. There wasn't room, for whatever reason, they didn't want to build those houses out at the fort. They decided to build them in town. Who had land for sale? Jarvis Davenport and the Davenport Group. There were some other investors in with Mr. Davenport. And they had property, 8 acres that they had for sale. And it came down to a money deal, as often is the case. And so they built Fort Meade, and this is what it looked like back in 1941 when the houses were first finished. And the Davenport Group, and we haven't been able to identify who his companion investors were, but you can imagine who some of the other well-off folks in town were throwing in money on the deal and owned this 8-acre plot that they wanted $1,800 for the land, and the government was going to offer $1,040. And so they went to court and they settled at a number somewhere in the middle, and haven't found what that number is yet either. But in $1,940, $1,800 would have been, that was more than lunch money, certainly. And Mr. Davenport, to his credit, didn't get to be a multimillionaire by making bad business decisions. And so they bargained hard with the government, and the government took the title to the land, and construction started. This is what one of the insides of the houses look like. These are old newspaper pictures here. Pretty modest, and I'll talk a little bit more about what it was like, and so will some of you who lived in Fort Meade or lived in the Comanche courthouses can talk about what it was like to live in those places before they were as remodeled as they are today. Nonetheless, they settled on the money for the land. The Henry Carlson Construction Company of Sioux Falls won the contract. They hired 22 workers to build the houses, and in about a little more than 90 days, they put up the buildings, created 35 residences, plus an administrative building on what is today Meade Avenue and a portion of Douglas Street. So 90 days to build houses that 81 years later still are safe, comfortable, nice houses in Sturgis, and the neighborhood still exists. And old timers still call it Comanche Court. And so even though the street was named Meade Avenue from the very beginning, the project was called Comanche Court, so named, of course, for the famous horse that spent some of his years out at the fort. The inside of the houses, and this is a typical kitchen. Virginia, you weren't born yet when we moved here, but the folks and our older sister Mary Ann, we moved into 1371 Meade Avenue, and the kitchen looked like this: steel cabinets. We didn't have the water heater in the kitchen anymore because the house my folks bought had a 3/4 basement underneath it, and so the water heater had been moved, and the laundry had been moved downstairs. But that's what a military wife, a military mom would have been expected to fall in on. A gas cooking stove, refrigerator, cupboards, not furniture. The soldiers would have been gathering that up on their own, but a 4-wire clothesline right out front, how convenient was that? And the other things that made them, the houses livable, and gas heat, which I think probably in Sturgis by then was depending on the neighborhood, was a relatively new feature for houses. It was gravity heat, you had a key to turn it up and down. And so everybody, mom, whoever had control of the key, was the thermostat for the family that lived inside. And that's just the way that worked. The 22 men who built the houses were quickly shadowed by other men in Sturgis who were just waiting for somebody to drop their hammer or their shovel and take over the work. That would have been a pretty good job in 1941 to get hired on a construction project like that. And so I think that probably explains how the whole deal was finished in about 3 months. Today, houses go up pretty quickly, but I don't think they get done up that fast anyway. So what happened then, 1940 turns to 1941, the first of the families move in. The houses weren't quite finished yet, but the ones that were finished, as soon as they were ready, a family would move in. And so by June, there were military families living on Comanche Court, or in Comanche Court, since it's really 2 streets, Meade Avenue and Douglas, and started keeping house there. Kids went to school, the dads, and it would have been all dads in the all-male army of that time, particularly for a cavalry unit, would have driven up to Nellie Street and connected up with Highway 34, 79, and gone out to the fort to go to work, and come home the same way. The city made sure that street, or those 2 streets, were in good repair and able to take the traffic. Can't be late for formation or whatever your duties were at the fort. These were against the top 3 grades of sergeants were eligible to live at Fort Meade. So the 4th Cavalry eventually does deploy. So the rumor kind of became true, and the war, of course, by then had started. The entire 100% of the Sturgis National Guard unit was already deployed, thinking, oh, we're going to just go for a year because that's what the original contract was for. Well, that stretched until the end of the war. The 4th Cavalry left Fort Meade. After the 4th Cavalry left, the 88th Glider Regiment came in for just a 10-month period, and they trained in conjunction with Rapid City Air Base at the time for their aviation support, and then they deployed, left the fort open. Well, by the time that had happened, the War Department and politicians and others realized that this is a big war. We've got lots of casualties from the war. We need to beef up the Veterans Administration hospital system to accommodate these soldiers that were sailors, airmen, and Marines that were coming back from the war that needed hospitalization, needed care, and so forth. So the decision was made in 1944 to turn the fort into a VA hospital, and housing was needed then. Well, Comanche Court was available. So the VA employees, some of them, moved into the fort. Some of the houses were vacant for a time, and they lived there as renters of one kind or another through the end of the war. Well, by 1948, there was, this is just an overhead view of what the neighborhood looks like pretty much today, and where the houses are. So 22 buildings, 35 residences. That dollar amount there is that's just arithmetic average that I took, doing a little math with some finished numbers. I don't know that you could ever track down the true total cost of the project, but roughly $3,500 a piece for each resident, recognizing that most of the homes were duplexes, so you just double that money. And this is a view today from what we who grew up there call the top of the court. It's always been the top. And And it's, now it's uphill, so I guess it's the top of the court. And this, the courtyard here, or the turnaround, the scene of when we were growing up, endless hide-and-go-seek games and other kinds of robust, healthful and probably not so helpful activities that youngsters could participate in this kind of neighborhood. Somewhere along the way, and I've forgotten the year, my folks and our neighbors, probably the Davises and the Brolls and the Hendricksons and some of these old original families in the court, were sitting around the kitchen table and did a quick little summary, and this would have been in the late 50s. There were 58 children that lived on Mead Avenue. So there was never any shortage of playmates. We're baby boom kids and lifelong friends or lifelong enemies, kind of depending on all the time of day. And Jimmy Davis and I still, we owe each other one more wrestling match, just to finally decree who's the winner. And Jim would win because he outweighed me and he was a little taller and a good bit more aggressive than I was. But anyway, we did spar a little bit in the neighborhood. I'll confess to that. So the duplexes, the seven single-family homes that were originally built, plus the admin building at 1355, I think is its address, were all part of the neighborhood. And then the 6 houses on Douglas Street. And on Douglas Street, the single-family homes, there were 7 homes built. 2 of them were 2-bedroom homes, and 5 were 3-bedroom homes. And why that was done differently, who knows? Size of the lot to build on, the money they had to spend. Some stingy bean counter in the Army that said, well, some of these families aren't that big, so a 2-bedroom home was good enough. And so that, who knows who made that decision, but that's just how it turned out. And it explains some of the price variations that went along as well. So after the war, as the VA hospital gets going, there's the residents that live there and the government, they wanted to sell the houses. And there was an argument about, or difference of opinion, about the selling price. The veterans that were already living there and other interested buyers wanted to buy the houses at their 1941 construction cost minus wear and tear and minus, however you could calculate it, the potential for loss from the relocation of Dead Man Creek. Dead Man Creek used to wiggle through the neighborhood kind of in where the street is, where Mead Avenue is today. And when the development got built, they just brought in bulldozers and just moved the creek over to roughly where the ditch is today. And so that these potential new buyers for the houses thought, because the government wanted to sell them at the market value of 1948. And it was a $1,500, $2,000 difference per house in those days. And that's enough to call your congressman. And so that's what they did. There was a group of residents there who got together and formed a kind of a primitive homeowners association to argue against this higher selling price. And they went to the 2 senators, congressmen, the VFW, the American Legion, the governor's office, and the cat next door. They got whoever they could get together as a political force to push back against this government decision. Not a military decision anymore. This was the Federal Housing Administration, or the 1940s version of that outfit that wanted the higher selling price. Now they're looking out for the taxpayer, and for the whole nation, wanting to recover money. from this investment. And the local vets in Sturgis said, we're vets. We just won the war. We want to live in Comanche Court. And thank you very much. We'd appreciate a cheaper price. And so they had the political muscle. The bureaucrats didn't have the same oomph behind their argument. And that argument was going on nationwide. And a Republican senator from West Virginia introduced legislation to nationwide permit the sale of all this excess military housing around the nation at the lower construction price and not the market value price. So the local vets win. And ultimately the houses start to sell, and there was a pecking order for who got to live in, I got to talk to my slide here for a minute. Part of the turmoil in Sturgis at the time was there was yet one more rumor that Fort Meade, the VA hospital, was going to close. The military had already pulled out. They were gone and never going to come back. And the VA was the replacement, still is the replacement. But a rumor started in town that the VA is going to pull out as well. Well, the local folks are getting nervous about that. And no less than the director of the hospital at the time, he was a psychiatrist, if I can find his name. Anyway, he's Harold Foster, Colonel, U.S. Army retired, veteran of World War I and World War II, was the VA, he was the Sherman Potter from the TV show. You remember, he was the old Army colonel that came in to run the VA hospital at the time. He assured everyone that no, what you're confusing this with, because there was not only would Fort Meade, the VA hospital closed, there was also discussion about moving what became Ellsworth Air Force Base to Fort Meade. Well, that never materialized. They already had their runway in Rapid City. You're not going to move all that here and rebuild it. Well, the government could, of course, and they've done things like that in the past, but smarter heads prevailed, I guess, and they kept the air base in Rapid City. And the VA hospital stays in business in Sturgis. Dr. Foster died the same year that he squelched the rumor. Poor guy had a heart attack. He's gone. And I don't know who replaced him. There have been a lot of directors at Fort Meade over the decades. And so there was this pecking order that was established for the sale of the houses. First in line were veterans who were already living in Comanche Court. If they could arrange the financing or had the money, they could buy a house. Number two were veterans not living in Comanche Court. Again, you'd have to have, talk to your banker and been ready to buy in those days. Then the third category were non-veterans living in Comanche Court. So these would have been hospital employees who weren't veterans living in Comanche Court. And if they were already renting in Comanche Court but didn't want to buy, they had a year to move out. So they didn't get, just a new buyer couldn't come in and say, I want to buy 1495 house. Sorry, renter, you're out of here. We're moving in tomorrow because I've got the deed of the house now. Well, the government was compassionate in that respect, and they had a 1 year move out clause for folks. And then all other interested buyers. So there was the open market. And as things turned out, I think nearly all of the original buyers and residents of Comanche Court were some way or another connected to Fort Meade as employees. And then over time, that started to melt away and change. When we came in 1954, our dad was a veteran, but not employed at Fort Meade. And he bought, my mom and dad bought the house at 1371 not for $2,800, but they bought from a family named Jim Austin. And Virginia will tell a bit about an experience that she had with the Austins, what, a year ago, 2 years ago?
Somewhere in there.
When it's your turn. Yeah. So, anyway, so the houses were already starting to turn over by the early 50s. And so this was an auction for two of the houses, 1355, which is the administrative, it was City Hall for Comanche Court during all the years that it was military housing. And then our house at 1371, they got put on the auction block in 1952. And they must not have sold because the folks bought from the Austins 2 years later. And the Wagner house stayed occupied by the Wagner family until they relocated to Sturgis. And the Chaffin family were the next owners and occupants of that house. Jake, Gonzella, and Kay, and the mom and dad. They were our immediate neighbors. And so, anyway, so these were the announced financing capabilities of the two owners. The Wagners were willing to carry $4,000 on some kind of a title for deed, the contract for deed arrangement, and the Austins were willing to finance $2,800. As I remember, when the folks moved in 1954, and it would have been early '54, they paid $4,000 for the house. And Kate sold that, was the realtor. So another old-timey game that goes way back in our recollections. So houses start to sell. The movement of families in and out starts, and we could probably, I calculated, and I'm not a good calculator, but in 81 years, there could be as many as 1,000 families matriculate in and out of Comanche Court as either renters or homeowners. So that's a lot of pickup trucks and farm trucks and moving vans and trailers and whatever in and out of the neighborhood. Seeing furniture and household goods and people move in and out of the house. The other thing that I think the neighborhood is, and all neighborhoods in town here are like this, but that started this endless cycle of remodeling and improving the houses. The house we grew up in was the first house to have a basement. And all the houses built on crawl spaces with 4-foot high foundation walls. And many of the houses, the sewer lines were put below the frost level, but they weren't put 9 feet into the earth. And so when the basements got dug out, and in our house it's like the sewer line is about 3 feet off the floor, and so good enough to drain the laundry, but you couldn't have a bathroom downstairs. And so by the time I was a teenager, I helped kill one of the elm trees in the backyard and come home late at night. Because I didn't want to go all the way into the house. So, but we boys were like that. So, endless remodeling, and likewise on Douglas Street. And I'm just going to read a paragraph here to give you a sample of what it was like. The most extensively remodeled house on Douglas Street is the former house owned by Bob and Linda Grants at 714. And then other houses along the Douglas Street portion of the neighborhood where the lots are flat and bigger, enabled garages, additions onto the houses in a more affordable fashion. They didn't have to get squeezed into some of the lots that are there and how all that exists. When the Brolls moved, they lived at the top of the court as renters, They rented from a family named Hogan, and other neighbors up there were the Smiths, and the Connollys, and the Kennys, and a family named Brown lived up there as well. Schwab was another family name from the early days.
Mr. Radigan lived up there for a while?
Oh, didn't it? Well, see, yeah, everybody lived in Comanche Court, you know, one way or another. And when
Mr. Bell.
the Brolls bought a house about in the middle of Meade Avenue, 1430 is their primary residence. They bought it from a family named Christofferson. Well, those of the many of us here in this room who know Squire and Evelyn, they never sat still. Because Evelyn was busy dusting the attic that we used to tease her about. So that's the standard for keeping house for Evelyn Roll, is that the attic was dusted, ready for visitors. I don't think we've ever dusted our attic. But the Rolls first used surplus bricks from Fort Meade and dug an elaborate three-level terrace in the backyard and built a flower garden and then a vegetable garden back there. We neighborhood kids got kind of the way Tom Sawyer got his buddies to paint the fence. We were all encouraged to come to the Rolls and go in the backyard, and it was kind of play for us, but we chinked the mortar off of thousands of bricks and then restacked them. And when it came time to build that brick terrace that's back there, why Squire used his buddies in the fire department, Bob Short, Lloyd Erickson, Herb Byerly, and they laid up the brick and created the steps and did all the work to dress up the backyard. They saved the elm tree with the one branch that you hung your deer from. Elm trees were throughout the neighborhood when we were growing up, and just about every house had a deer tree. Lynn, yours probably, you had at least one.
Yeah, if they look at the pictures back there, they'll see most of the pictures have dead animals hanging.
Yeah. We had a deer tree at our house, and the Brolls had one. And in fact, that tree got trimmed somewhere along the way, and Squire saved the one dead branch that was hung his deer every year. So. Anyway, so they built the garden terrace first. Then a few years later, they dug out the basement underneath the whole duplex and finished the basement. And they built a 2-bedroom apartment underneath 1430, and then their renters had access for a basement storage area and a utility room. They finally got the water heater out of the kitchen, put it downstairs. Over time, the Barnes family put a basement underneath their house. The Heberts put a small basement, kind of a utility room sort of a thing underneath their house, directly across the street from us. And I don't know if other homes have had excavations like that or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. And garages and porches and additions, other changes that went along with the house, or came along with the houses as they went into private ownership, and particularly if the owner wasn't just going to be an investment owner and they were going to live there, why it's just instinctive as you can afford it that you improve your house. And folks have done that for more than nearly 80 years. Anyway, one of the things that is a recollection for those of us that have been in the neighborhood for a long time is the arrival of television. And not only for Meade Avenue, but the way that television came into the Black Hills. We moved here in 1954, and we brought a television with us from Minneapolis. We were hip and trendy. And how my mom afforded that TV, I don't know, but nonetheless, we had a television. And it sat dark and cold in a closet for I think 4 or 5 years and taunted us. that That's a television and it works. You can't turn it on. And we didn't have an antenna. And for whatever reason, the folks didn't go out and buy one right away. The Herbst family were that was the first family to have a television in Comanche Court, and in the living room of their house, and we neighborhood kids would peek in the windows. Two of my accomplices here, and kind of try to crawl up in the lilac bush so we could get a little better view, and watch TV through their living room window. And that was when the weather was nice. It wasn't, and every now and then the Herbsts were generous, and well, you kids come on in, and we'd watch whatever it was, and then we had to go. And but what a treat that was. And that darn Stewart Warner brand TV sat in our house.
It's still there.
And it's still at the house, okay, good. It doesn't work anymore. No, okay. But our dad, being thrift-minded, and our mom thrift-minded to the second power, decided that he could build an antenna. He was a construction worker. He worked in Rapid City. His construction buddies, because TV was in Rapid City by then, going full blast. Well, Ed, you just get some 2x2s and you make a little frame and you get some copper wire and stretch it on there, and you got an antenna. You don't have to spend $20 down in Lushville House or one of the other hardware stores for a TV antenna. That's a waste. And so he built an antenna. It was November, toward the end of the construction season, and he came home. I remember coming home one night, and it was going to be the night we were going to try the antenna. So we have supper, and get out the ladder, and he gets up on the roof, and we get the wire, the lead-in wire and all that hooked up to the TV, and we've turned it on, and we've tuned it to channel 3, KOTA, and Ed Grohl's on the roof of 1371 holding the antenna, and we were down in the kitchen, no, Pa, turn it to the left, no, right there. And it was in some precarious position where he couldn't leave it. And I think the real magic of why we could see the picture was that the antenna wasn't that little frame of 2x2s with copper wire. Ed Kroll was the antenna. The signal was coming through him first, and that's what made it work. And finally it was, and he's disgusted, and it's cold, it's dark. He had to go to work the next day. And so the antenna just laid up there on the roof of the house for a while. And they finally went downtown and bought an antenna so that we could watch television. But yeah, no, Pa, left. There you go. I can hear us kids, giving recommendations to him on how to tune the antenna. So, and if he would have had more change in his pockets or whatever, maybe we would have seen a color picture. I don't know. That would have been part of the deal. So and if you drive in the neighborhood today, it's just endless changes to the neighborhood. It's always changing. So the final thing that I'll talk a little bit about, and then we're going to open it up to the audience here for recollections of things, is Dead Man Creek. Today it's the ditch. For better or for worse, it's the ditch. Been there since 1980, I think, when the project was finished. And there haven't been any floods since then, or none that threatened the houses or anything like that. This is a construction picture of, and that's a view of what it looks like today. The creek, and Terry will authenticate this for me, and Maureen, his sister's here as well. an endless playground for mischief, adventure, what have you, in the creek. And in the springtime, in a wet year, the creek would run. 3 or 4 times, it would be terrifyingly full. Never flooded in any of the houses, but it just right to the top. And the rest of the time, it would run half full or less. And when it was kind of shin deep on a 11-year-old, why, it was fun. We threw rocks and we built dams and fantasized about, oh, the fish are gonna come back and, you know, all this kind of stuff. One terrifying day in 1957, Marta Conley, who was 8 at the time, and a bunch of kids playing in the creek, she slipped, fell in, was waiting. I wasn't there to witness it, but she went in the water, and it was a 911 deal. And she's going down the creek in great peril for an 8-year-old kid. And Gary Patterson, who wasn't a Comanche Court kid, he lived up the hill just behind the playground, was there because he intermingled with, he was part of our gang of mostly boys that were there and playmates. And Gary was 11 at the time. He ran down the bank of the creek, and Marta's, you know, really in danger of drowning, going down the creek, and he splashed into the water and picked her up and pulled her back out, saved her life. And that was a big deal when that happened. And Gary wasn't a Boy Scout, so he couldn't get the Boy Scout award for saving a life, and I've forgotten the name of what that award is. But he was honored and received something called the Carnegie Hero Award for his efforts. And that was a nationwide campaign that recognized people who were lifesavers of one kind or another. And so he and Marta, I don't know where she is these days, but Gary's still around, and I see him every now and then. And so that was Dead Man Creek, for better or for worse. The ditch project, eventually, you know, it cost millions of dollars. It carries water safely, you know, from Dead Man, the old Fort Meade dams, through town and into Bearview Creek, and everybody's rescued, I guess, or saved by that. But the magic and the romance of the old Dead Man Creek we'll never get it back, you know, and that's regrettable. There were chokecherry bushes and oak trees. Yeah, big oak trees, and our clothesline got moved from the side of the house to the backyard. And one morning, either fall or spring, although our mom washed clothes and hung on the line year round. That was a point of pride for her. We had a dryer, but she hung outside. And she was out hanging sheets or something like that, and she could hear, and thought, what in the world is going on? And she just glanced around, and a woodpecker was hanging on the side of the chimney for the furnace.
We were in the house.
Oh, they were
It
inside?
sounded like it was blowing up.
Oh, you were, okay.
Yeah. It scared the heck out of us.
We lived in a neighborhood in Virginia that had pileated woodpeckers, which are as big as chickens. And they would hammer on the chimneys in our neighborhood. You could hear them. It would be the end of the world if you were inside. So a couple of other recollections that I hope others will talk about as well, and that is the playground. Was an informal sandlot for many, many years, and we played baseball there, and marbles, and got into fistfights and arguments. And one of the last things that I can remember doing there, and probably would have been about 7th grade or so, I had a bow and arrow, and so did some of the other boys. And we'd go down there to the sandlot, and we would shoot our arrows up in the air to see whose arrow would go the farthest. And you'd draw back a little bit, and you'd shoot. And so you could watch it, so you'd get out of the way, and then you'd draw back a little bit more, and then somebody in the neighborhood brought a bigger bow, probably one of the Hendricksons, and drew back sufficiently to send the arrow out of sight. And it's, now what? So we all, I don't know, there were 3 or 4 of us boys, we all ran and we hid underneath the galvanized metal slide that was there. And that arrow finally did return to earth. It didn't hit the slide, and it didn't hit where we were standing, but it was close enough that, Sturgis boy, age 12, killed by an arrow, would have been the headline or something like that. So that was their other adventures. The Kinney boys there, and there were different categories of age groups. There were the little kids, and the kind of medium kids, and then the older kids. And I have a boy's perspective of all of that. But Don Kinney, Dean Kinney's dad, and your brother Ray, and maybe you, Terry, and some others, they built a little clubhouse in the creek behind the Daney house. And out of lumber from cantaloupe crates. And that summer, a grocery store could put the cantaloupe crate out at the trash, and in 5 minutes, one of us Comanche Court kids would have snagged that box and taken it back.
Archie Haley donated a lot of them.
No, okay, Archie did, okay. And then that little clubhouse got built back in. And it was a den of iniquity where the older boys smoked cigarettes and talked about older things. And we kind of medium kids you had to be invited in. And all of that. So that was part of the experience of being there. When I contacted the Brolls, Larry, Carolyn, and Jean, and they sent back to me some of their recollections of growing up in the neighborhood. Larry talked about his dad's garbage hauling business and the old truck that they had, and how important that was to their family's finances, and it provided employment. Because every fireman's always got at least 2 other jobs, if not more. And for Squire, it was this downtown garbage route and the old truck that they had. And digging fossils out of the backyard of the Rolls house, that was another important pastime. And Carolyn and Jean all brought back and spoke of roller skating, with clamp-on roller skates, on sidewalk that in those days was still relatively, it was all built at the same time, so it was all at the same grade, and there were pretty decent patches of smooth sidewalk. And so they taught themselves how to roller skate there, and how to hop up over the cracks in the sidewalk and the like. And then the wintertime activities of, like the rest of us who grew up in a safe and nurturing neighborhood, of board games and watching TV when it finally came along, and the piano and all these other things that were part of family life in those days, and what it was like to grow up there. I'll tell one more story, then I'm running out of voice, and there are lots of stories to tell. Next to the Brolls at 1430, so the next house to the north, there's a family named Redder, and the dad was a fireman at Fort Meade, and they had a son named Chuck, and he wasn't a teenager, but he wasn't a little kid anymore either. He would have been 11, 12 years old, and Chuck was left-handed. And when I came to Comanche Court, I turned 7 not long after we moved. I had not played baseball. I grew up in this odd neighborhood in Minneapolis, and there were no boys to play with. And My immigrant grandfather didn't know baseball from Copenhagen Smooths, you know, that was his. Bless his heart, he couldn't teach me how to play baseball. Chuck Ritter taught a whole bunch of little boys in the neighborhood how to hit. Well, I'm right-handed, most people are right-handed. Chuck taught us all to hit left-handed, because it was here, just like, watch me, and he'd hit, and then he'd say, no, put the bat this way, you know, so we put the bat on our left shoulder, and, you know, that's how we learned to hit. I could never hit a ball beyond second base, because I was using the wrong arm, but nonetheless, I don't know where Chuck is these days, but he changed me, I guess, and I shovel snow left-handed, I sweep with a broom left-handed, play hockey left-handed, but I sure do everything else with my right hand. So, with that, Virginia, Terry, Maureen, Lynn, who else has lived in Comanche Court? Kathy? Oh, man. As long as I'm freewheeling here, I've got to tell. Comanche Court had the 35 residences, 14 duplexes, and 7 single-family homes. In the 1950s, was it? Your family moved a house into Comanche Court.
No, it was there.
When you moved, okay.
We didn't move that into that house until 1957.
57, okay. It had already been moved in and set up, and I understood that was a house from the Oahe Dam construction project.
Yes.
It was an excess house that had been moved, and there were houses being moved around the Black Hills in those years. It was not unusual to see the Parker brothers or somebody else jacked up a house and they were moving from point A to point B. A good number of the buildings from Ellsworth got moved and dispersed throughout the Black Hills. So that house got built, adding one more residence to the neighborhood. And then in the 1970s, the Erickson family built a house just to the north, in between the Eisenberger's house and the park. And that house is there today, you know, still serving as a family home. So the neighborhood has grown a little bit. And so with that, Virginia, how many times have first responders come to Comanche Court? Since that's your trade.
Maybe a dozen.
A dozen, okay.
Couple deaths, fire, and domestics.
Okay.
So nothing real exciting.
Real exciting, yeah. How many times has the street been paved?
Oh, geez, twice. It doesn't seem like very many.
Not enough.
No.
Well, our dad was a construction worker. He worked in Rapid City. And more than once, and he drove a company pickup truck. He was a foreman for these construction companies. More than once, he would bring home 4 or 5 bushels full of asphalt. And we did a little informal repair of some of the potholes that he just couldn't stand anymore. He knew how to fix them. And so we did that. And likewise, sidewalk repair and replacement. Once the neighborhood switched from government ownership to private ownership, why that all became an individual responsibility. And some residents were more responsible than others. And so the sidewalks would ebb and flow over the years. Street lighting the same way as time went along, and it got improved from the old. There were just 300-watt light bulbs in the neighborhood when we first moved there. And occasionally we would throw rocks at them, and I can't remember why we did that. But you're not talking, are you, Karen? So I'm going to leave the story of the bridges. Lynn, if you could tell us a little bit about your dad's project, and what you remember of Cecil Barnes's bridge as well.
I'm Linn Hendrickson. I lived in Comanche Court starting in about 1952. Just a little bit of history. When they came for sale, my dad had just received his bachelor's degree in education from Black Hills Teachers College, which gave him a full-time gig. Prior to that, he financed, in addition to the GI Bill, he had financed his way through college by raising mink. And when he got a full-time gig as a school teacher at Sturgis High School, he sold the mink, and he made a pretty good check, about a $17,000 check or so. But he needed to have something to do with the money, so he bought 2 of the duplexes in Comanche Court in 1952 with his mink money. And then we moved in there in about 1952. We lived there through about 56, and we moved to a house up on Junction Avenue. My dad's contract in 1952 was for the teachers in the crowd. He was making $1,200 a year, $100 a month as a teacher in Sturgis High School. The house on Junction Avenue was costing us $75 a month for the house payment. My dad couldn't afford it, so we moved back to Comanche Court in 1956. And we stayed there, and I stayed there. That was my home until I graduated from college and went off to do great and wonderful things around the world. But that's kind of our history. In about the early 60s, my dad was in the National Guard and had served for a short period of time as the commander of the 109th Engineer Battalion. They had a thing in those days, and you might be able to help me a little with this, Dave, was I think it was called the Bailey Bridge. It was a prefabricated bridge. It came in sections. You got a bridge company, and they would get these bridge sets, and they would have so much of a span, they could go ahead of armored or infantry troops to make sure that they had crossings over ditches, rivers, places that would not otherwise be crossable. These Bailey Bridge had about 25-foot aluminum sections that they would then come in, they dump them, they bolt them together, and they could make a bridge. In training, some of these would get damaged. My dad got 2 of those damaged aluminum sections. And they weren't quite enough to span the bridge across Dead Man Creek, so we had to come up with another set of log apparatuses that he rested those on, and then the opposite side rested on the bank toward town. And then he put bridge planks in it, and we were actually able to drive a standard vehicle across that. So we were, and in those days, you have to remember, there was not a city compliance inspector. There was very little in the way of zoning. So when you wanted to build a bridge, you just built a bridge. And I remember the city used to like it because they could sit up there at night with their spotlight and shoot skunks that would go up and down the creek. And they'd spotlight, because the skunks would get into the garbage and they had rabies, etc. So the city would go up and down Dead Man Creek behind our places and shoot skunks at night. But they liked being able to sit on the bridge because they could look way up, all the way past Barnes's to the south, and all the way down to Douglas Street on the north. And they hit them with a spotlight, and then at 2 o'clock in the morning, you get jolted out of bed because the 12 gauge would go off outside your window. And then they buried, I'd go out, I was a kid, that was a great adventure, I'd go out there and they'd bury them right in the creek bed, right by your house, so that your house smelled like skunk for about 2 weeks. Anyway, so that was the bridge, and that was a bit in the early 60s, about 1967 or so. Now, the reason that my dad had these bridge spans was because some of them were damaged. And there was a damaged spot in one of them, and we were driving across it one day, and that span buckled, and I was in the back seat of my dad's Jeep looking up toward the sky going, what happened? My dad just hit the gas and we drove up the other side, and we did not roll into the creek. But then it sat there damaged for quite some time, and we eventually had to take it out. Now the Barnes Bridge was just right next to us, and it was just a probably 4-foot wide footbridge. Because we owned the property on the other side of the creek, but you couldn't access it. And what Cecil Barnes did is he had a little workshop on the other side of the creek, and in order to access it, he built about a 4-foot wide footbridge across the bridge on his side. And so that's the story of the bridges. But again, that was back before the days of compliance inspectors.
The
Well, I can kind of add to the Barnes
Yep.
And,
And you are,
what, I'm Jim Holland,
oh.
Kathy's little brother.
I know.
Yeah, okay. But remember the Barnes family had this bridge, and every time the creek would come up when it would rain, I think it happened twice, and 64 was one, it took that bridge out every time. Well, Cecil said, enough of this. So the last time, he apparently got hold of some engineers or something, they drove old telephone poles into the bank on either side, and they built the bridge on that. Bridge was not going anywhere. But until June 9th, 1972, when the big flood came in, and I remember going down there, the bank had been eaten out around the bridge, and the poles were still there, in the ground, and a little bit of the planking on the bridge was still there, but of course the rest of it was gone. And of course after that, they never rebuilt it because they were going to put in the channel.
And I remember that flood in '64 specifically, because it was the one time Squire Broll came across. Of course, Squire Broll at the time was a first responder. He was a fireman out of Fort Meade. He came around all the homes and evacuated the homes in Comanche Court. And so my dad was at summer camp, of course, with the National Guard, so we were there. So my mom grabbed the Jeep and loaded us kids up. And Squire says, you gotta go, because the water was right up to the back of where our homes were on that west side. Anyway, so we load up, my mom and then my dad, or my brother and I load up in the Jeep, and we go to my grandmother's house, because we had to be evacuated. Well, where our house was, we were probably 100 feet from Dead Man. It was flooded. So we went to my grandfather's house on Sly Street, which is about 15 feet from Dead Man. So we didn't gain much, but we did evacuate.
And that speaks, I guess, to the hazards of the creek, and, you know, I can understand the city fathers and Corps of Engineers and others. You know, we gotta do something here. The creek is just, we put all these people at risk. Let's build the ditch. I just wish it was a little bit more like a canal in Venice or San Antonio.
Yeah.
Or something.
Just real quick too, you talk about digging basements, most of those homes didn't have basements, because when they moved the creek, that whole creek bed was full of springs. And so it almost, I know Squire Broll had one, there were several homes along there that had sump pumps in their basement to keep the spring water pumped out of their basements that they put in, because otherwise they'd have been flooded all the time from those springs. And you can, right there where we're at, you can still, I think in that picture, you can still see where those springs.
Yeah, they're seeping here.
Into the channel. And all of those homes along that side had sump pumps, because you couldn't put a basement in and keep them flooded.
Other stories? I mean, the Smiths, you guys have gotta have a Halloween story.
I don't know if I want to repeat any of them. I wind up in the jail.
There's a statute of limitations. It's okay.
Dave didn't mention the modern convenience of the water heaters we had in the buildings. They were sidearm heated water heaters. And they looked like an old boiler off of a steam engine. And they did have no safety belts on them, no jackets. And you heated the water just about as hot as you could get it. And then you turn this valve on and I would pipe it into the bathtub on the other side of the wall. And you turn that valve on and it about blow you out of the tub. It didn't scald you first, it would wash you out of the tub. But I remember that thing, you fire it up and you'd hear that thing cracking and popping on the other side of the wall. And why they didn't blow up is beyond me. And the last one I seen is at Conley's. And they bought that duplex. And they never shut off that one side of the duplex. They left the gas on the cook stove, but they did replace the water heater. And it was laying into the dirt crawl space. And I seen it under there, and I said, what are you gonna do with that thing? Well, if you want, you can have it. So I took it. What I was gonna do with it, I have no idea. And I finally was all off to the dump.
We finally got told to call it off,
So those, yeah, and the Conley family, they're a single mom there, Martha,
Martha and
and 6 kids.
Um,
Marlon is already in college,
yeah.
and the oldest sister got married right after high school. But then the 4 Dennis and Mike and 2 daughters, 2 sisters,
Right.
all lived in that house, and they raised rabbits in the backyard.
That was Dennis did,
That was
yeah.
Dennis.
Now, Martha Sue has passed on.
Oh, she has, okay.
Long time ago.
Uh,
I still call her Susie.
So does the rest of the family, so that's okay.
I'm not gonna get shot for calling you Susie.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, we had nicknames, you knew what was going on in the neighborhood. I think by the time I was in junior high, I had been inside of every house in the neighborhood as an invited, playmate, or folks would go somewhere and they'd, well, what are we gonna do with Dave? Well, he could stay with the Bros or somebody else's or whatever. They got kind of passed around in the neighborhood for weekends and the like, and nothing bad happened, and got to know people, and more of what was going on in that neighborhood. So, a great place to live, a great place to grow up, harvest memories that are with us forever, and a connection that in a room like this, and folks are gonna stay here, I would imagine, for a little bit anyway. Oh, you used to live in the court. And that's kind of all that it would take in order to be the introduction. Well, I lived there too. Well, where did you live? Well, we lived in the gray house that was next door to the, and then the stories flow from there. I trust that there are other neighborhoods in Sturgis that have that same kind of glue that keeps people together. It's just that those of us that grew up in Comanche Court, our glue's better.
That's
There's a pretty special bond with that bunch.
a lot of things nobody wants to talk about. I do have to tell you that the upper, that was, the official name is the Circle.
The circle.
The circle.
The Circle, that's it.
That was the name of
The
it.
top.
That was our
The top.
base. And the Howlands, didn't you have some good apple trees back then? Or was it the Donaldsons next door?
No, Dawson.
No.
That was another thing we did, we'd steal apples.
Then we sat around the circle and eat them.
Yeah.
That explains that.
Yes.
So, great fun, and
When we got really nasty.
and now we have gray hair or no hair, and we're getting old and creaky and the like, but we certainly have our memories of being there. So I thank everyone for coming here today and listening and passing on some wisdom of what it was like to grow up there. Lynn brought a couple of scrapbooks that have got pictures of famous deer trees, at least for the Hendricksons.
There's some from the backyard of where we were on Junction, or on Comanche Court. The rest of them are also cabin pictures from our cabin. Not people may be aware of that, so feel free to page through it.
It's just a great time. I thank you, and
Thank you, Dave.
thank you, Suze.
Just one thing, talking about the flood reminded me that we are still looking for participants for our May History at High Noon. Maybe Jim, you're gonna have to come be part of our panel that we're gonna have together on memories of the flood. It'll be 50 years in June. And we're going to have people here that will be sharing their memories, as well as other members of the audience, that might remember what they were doing. And it will be on what happened in Sturgis during the 72 flood. And on behalf of the High Noon Committee, here's a little gift for you, David. Thank you so much.
Well,
Let's give it up. Thanks for coming.
I have a formal script that it would be impossible for me to stand up here and just read that. But that will become part of the record of the meeting here and what we talked about today.
That'd be good.
So, that's got the numbers and the details and the names of the people.
That's it.
Things like that, down to the house numbers.